This is Tuesday, January 5th, 2021, and we are in the second lecture of Unit 3 for European History. Yesterday, we did a review of where we've been thus far this year, going back to the beginning of the year, and I also looked ahead at what this unit would bring. This unit begins in 1815 and ends in 1914. It is, in terms of time, the shortest of the four units of the year, and it falls from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 to the beginning of World War I in 1914. It is just a century, and it's going to be dominated by some of the things that we're talking about today. Let's see, we also compared the maps between 1815 and 1914. Ever notice that? Sure, so. Taking notes on it. Aside from some minor border changes to several countries like Russia or Austria, the appearance of Norway, the division of Netherlands into Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, French loss of Alsace-Lorraine, and their gains of Nice and Savoy. The biggest changes to the map are in the center of Europe, where the region formerly dominated by the Papal States and the Holy Roman Empire unify into the nations of the Kingdom of Italy and the German Empire. Dankeschön. Here. So that will give you some notion of the before and after picture. The thing that's hard for anyone here, including me, to really grasp is precisely how war-weary people were. Everyone had lost family or friends, or had themselves been in war. There wasn't a family, a village, anywhere from Moscow to the Atlantic that had not been ravaged in some way, shape, or form by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Everyone's lives were touched. And this went on from 1789 to 1815. Let's see, if I do my math correctly, that's 26 years. 26 years ago was 1997? No. My math was bad. 26 years ago would have been, if we count from 2021, 1995. I was still a young man. I didn't have hair, but I was younger, and the hair was black. I had just started growing a goatee, which would eventually become the beard. And my wife and I had been married for 5 years. And I was running a residential program in Maine for people that were being moved out of a state institution for the mentally retarded and developmentally disabled. It's a long time ago. Bill Clinton was still in his first term as president, and the biggest world event was still the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War and the American victory in that war, as well as the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War of 1991, which saw fewer than 300 American dead versus over 100,000 Iraqi dead. It was a time of relative peace and prosperity, very little like our world today, post 9/11, and facing the rise of China's Communist Party. But, if God forbid, the Chinese communist leadership underestimates the dangers of modern war, which is something the Russians never did in the Cold War because they had experienced World War II and World War I, some of them. They were old enough to remember that. Where over 30 million Russians were killed as a result of the war directly, where everything basically that the Germans touched had been hit with scorched earth and ravaged by grinding battles. The Russians didn't want to experience that again. So the Cold War between the United States and them was a matter of brinksmanship, like a dance, like a threat display between two primates, where one side threatens and the other side backs off, but then threatens over here. But nobody comes to blows beyond a few nips and slaps because there are no hospitals in the natural world. And if you end up injuring yourself too much in the process of defeating your opponent, not only might you not mate, but you might die. The Russians understood this. So we could play a game of threat and counter-threat with them with some hope that their terrible memories of the Second World War would keep them from doing something rash. The current leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has no experience at all like that. Their experience is wholly made up of oppressing a captive people, a slave population that they keep in check by secret police, modern technology, and a military loyal to the party, not the nation. They also have a chip on their shoulder from the so-called century of change, shame, between the Opium War of 1842 and the Chinese Communist victory in 1949. And that chip on the shoulder encourages them to do dramatic things like take Taiwan by force. Taiwan being an independent nation since 1949. And an example of how Chinese people culturally and racially are perfectly capable of running a very effective, successful democracy, which is something the Chinese Communist Party denies and finds embarrassing. If they become rash, which they're quite capable of being, we may end up experiencing a world war, or a war, in any case, bigger than anything we fought since 1945. Bigger than Korea, bigger than Vietnam, certainly bigger than the various aspects of the War on Terror. And if, God forbid, that horror show ensues, you'll personally know, when you're older, what it's like to be war-weary. People of Europe, after the Napoleonic Wars, were deeply, deeply war-weary. They did not want to ever go through what they had gone through again. This is true of people in the countryside, in the cities, poor and wealthy. Every group of people had suffered grievous harm as a result of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And everyone wanted that to stop. They never wanted to experience that again. This created an opportunity which Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian Empire's foreign minister, was going to utilize in setting up probably the most successful peace treaty of the last few hundred years. The Congress of Vienna comes together in 1815. Vienna is the capital city of the Austrian Empire. And all of the victorious powers send representatives. And the new government of France is also represented, the government that the victorious powers installed, the Kingdom of France, the revived Kingdom of France. At the Congress of Vienna, they have one overriding goal: to prevent another war, another major European war, another general war, another world war. And the way they choose, because these people saw Napoleon as an outgrowth of the radical ideals of the French Revolution, were to turn back the clock and then freeze time. Turn back the clock. That's very difficult to actually do. There's a rather vulgar joke. I'm going to... yes, because I already alluded to it. Just understand that it is a vulgar joke. And if you don't want to hear it, got these. What is the difference between a pregnant woman and a light bulb? You've all heard this, I assume, at one point or another. You can unscrew a light bulb. The joke there is that there are certain things you can't take back, including becoming pregnant. Happens, you got to deal with it. Another thing you can't take back, squeezing the trigger on a loaded firearm. Once you squeeze that trigger, once the bullet leaves the barrel, ballistic forces take over and you have no control. That bullet will travel where it will go, and there is nothing you can do to take it back. Or if you're driving a vehicle and you make a mistake, you cannot undo an accident or running over somebody's pet or running over a human being. There are certain actions once taken that cannot be undone. And this is how we learn. We learn from misery as well as joy. We learn from failure as well as success. And you each will have things in your life, and I hope you don't have many of them or any of them yet, that will make you ashamed and regretful until your dying day. Because we're human beings, we make errors, we make mistakes, we do things that we later deeply regret. Try to keep those to a minimum. You can't really turn back time. Innocence once lost can never be reclaimed. This is why it's so horrible when a child is molested. My mother worked for 20 years as a detective in Wallingford, Connecticut. And because she was the first police detective that was female, she dealt with cases that would make the Vietnam and Korean War vets that she worked with blanch with just horror, because she dealt with rape and child molestation and the kind of crimes that no one wants to think about. A good, clean, armed robbery is infinitely better to deal with than something like that. It's not just that the child goes through horror. It's that the child's sense of the world as being a place where good things can happen, that's reasonably safe, will never come back, ever, ever, ever. Even if they psychologically build back a psyche that's capable of living a happy and functional life, there will always be an existential doubt about everything. In some ways equivalent to the Holocaust survivor I once worked with in the summer of 1986. She had lived through the Theresienstadt ghetto and Auschwitz. Now, you'll know about those if you don't already when we do the Holocaust. She always had food on her. She always did things that most Americans just wouldn't understand, because she'd experienced starvation. She'd experienced the cruelty that human beings could do. She had a furtive, almost rat-like look about her, because that is what kept her alive as a young girl, an adolescent girl in the death camps. Her childhood gone. So the people who set up the Congress of Vienna understand on some basic level that they can't turn back time, that innocence once lost can never be regained, and that a system whereby kings rule and peasants work in the fields and the middle class do their thing in the towns and cities, where that is a world where that is just taken for granted, will be a long time coming back. Really, it won't come back until the generations that experienced the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars die off, so that new generations that never experienced such traumas can dream the dream of peace. The Congress of Vienna, though, is going to try to give them that peace. So, to the extent possible, they undo a large number of Napoleon's reforms. They don't undo the Napoleonic Law Code. They keep that. And Europe still uses that as its primary code of laws today, west of Russia, east of Britain. They also keep the larger consolidations of German and Italian states that Napoleon had done when he reorganized those areas. Before that, there were over 100 small and medium-sized German states. After that, there were a dozen or more. And Italy had an analogous system. So Napoleon's changes, most of them were scrapped. Some of them, like the consolidation of Central Europe and the Napoleonic Code, was kept. In France, they established the Bourbon monarchy again with a brother, uncle, cousin of the old King Louis the 16th, and I think he was called Louis the 18th because Louis the 17th would have been the young crown prince that was left to Parisian criminals and died of abuse and neglect. In any case, they establish a kingdom of France, and they reestablish the old monarchies in and throughout Europe. Because they see Napoleon and the French Revolution as an outgrowth of radicalism, they distance themselves from the Enlightenment. These are European-style conservatives. Now, if we ever did political science together, either in the form of a civics class or 12th grade government and politics, you would know right now that the terms we use for people in the political spectrum are messed up. The true terms have conservatives be papists and monarchists. The people who were at the Congress at Vienna setting things up were either papists and monarchists in the case of the Catholics, and monarchists in the case of the Protestants. They wanted a return to monarchy. But this was not going to be the blithe, absolutist monarchy that had been set up before the French Revolution. This was going to be a new style of monarchy that was quite aware that the people could turn on them, and that was quite interested in doing all they could to make sure that that never happened again. So they turned back the clock, and then they aspired to stasis. Stasis. Stasis is when you freeze time. Right now, if we ever want to go into deep space, even as far as nearby planets like Mars or Ceres in the asteroid belt or the moons of Jupiter, we're either going to need to build very large ships that can keep people sane and healthy mentally and physically for several years, maybe decades of time, or we're going to have to find a way to hibernate, to induce hibernation in human beings. Some people think that's possible through cryogenics, cold sleep they call it. Basically doing what?
I'm thinking of the beginning of Avatar.
Never saw Avatar, but yeah.
Yeah, he gets out in the giant spaceship out of a cryo.
Yeah, and Alien, who's made by the same guy, and Aliens do the same thing. They always get out of cryo chambers. And good. I just, for whatever reason, Avatar rubbed me the wrong way.
It's one of my favorite movies. So
good. I'm glad. Maybe I should see it. Didn't trust the politics of it. Old curmudgeon. Anyway, see if you've never seen Alien or Aliens, see those, and let me know what you think in terms of the difference. In any case, there may be other ways, but the advantage of putting human beings into hibernation is that, okay, they take off, they leave Earth orbit, and you set course for wherever it is you're going. And then once you're in hibernation, you don't have to consume food. The atmosphere in the ship does not need to be continually rejuvenated. Your materials are not going to be consumed quickly. But even more important than that, human beings are susceptible to cabin fever. No doubt the people chosen for long-duration spaceflight will be psychologically tested so that every opportunity to find somebody who's claustrophobic or who has a tendency for cabin fever or other psychological conditions brought on by extreme isolation would be weeded out. But you never know. You never know. Hibernation reduces that. They go to sleep as we're leaving Earth orbit, and they wake up as they're arriving in the orbital space of the destination. And so psychologically, they don't have to spend years of their life in boredom on a ship that probably has as much area as this classroom. Year after bloody year after bloody year. So hibernation could be an answer to that. But we don't have the technology yet. We may never have the technology. We'll see. What Metternich wants to do is put Europe's political system into hibernation, basically through stasis. And his method is called the Concert of Europe. Now, some of you are musicians. You have what Mr. Harrison calls the music bone. At least I've heard him refer to it as that. Which means you can do things I envy and admire. I love listening to music, but I can't make it. Well, I can make sounds that are sort of musical, but it's not really what you'd call mellifluous. It's not really something you volunteer to listen to. And the thing, looking for the book, particular book, for some reason, obviously where it should be. The reason I put it there is so I don't have to look for it in the middle of class. Obviously that didn't work out this time. Anyway, for music to work, the timing has to be right. And everyone has to play euphonically, harmoniously. You can't just do your own thing if you're in a symphony orchestra. If you're in a small jazz ensemble, yeah. But in a symphony orchestra, looking for my Russian section, you really can't. In order for the orchestra to produce music that is more than the sum of its parts, the various musicians need to subordinate themselves to what the composer wrote and I recreate it from memory. Really shouldn't be something lost. But when I move things around this summer, obviously did. I'll find it. Okay. In other words, you simply got to play in harmony. Otherwise, it won't work. It'll sound like an orchestra tuning up. In order for stasis to be achieved, the powers of Europe need to act like a symphony orchestra. Each empire or kingdom needs to act like an instrument in that orchestra, like a player, making sure that they work to a common goal. Now, who are the members of this club that is the Concert of Europe? Well, you've got Great Britain, the most liberal of the powers, liberal in the sense of liberty-oriented Enlightenment ideas. They have their parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. But at this time, the House of Commons is not elected by universal male suffrage. It's elected by male suffrage of aristocrats and middle-class people who own a certain amount of property. Some of this is finessed through location. Some of this is finessed through voting requirements. But still, the fact that, like the early American Republic, you restrict the franchise to men of property, you're restricting the franchise to people who have made success with their lives and who understand how the world works. And presumably they'll be wise stewards of the vote that they have. But Great Britain in 1815 is very different from the modern United Kingdom. It has a much smaller group of voters, much more conservative group of voters. The king has much more power than the queen has today. And the traditions that govern British society are alive and well and are things that people believe will keep another Napoleonic War from happening. People are loyal to them. France, you can expect France to have the deepest scars of all. It's like, what group of people besides the Jews did Hitler oppress the most? The answer is the Germans. What group of people did the Chinese Communist Party harm the most? It's the people of mainland China. I'm not an anti-Chinese Communist Party fellow because I'm anti-Chinese. I mean it. I have family members who were born in the People's Republic of China and who escaped. I love them, and I love what China was and what China could be if these gangsters weren't in charge. France, whether you believe in the ideals of the revolution or not, was where so much of the struggles went down that it is a society that is damaged and it's going to take generations to heal. Really, it isn't until just before, arguably, even when the First World War starts, 99 years later, France is still somewhat suffering from the scars of what happened between 1789 and 1815. But France is involved in this too. They have to be a member of the Concert of Europe because they are a great power. Austria in South Central Europe, Russia in Eastern Europe, these countries are going to work together towards a common cause. And what is that cause? It is stasis. And how will that stasis be achieved? They'll work in concert. I'm talking in circles. What do? They commit to promising one another that they will help each other fight revolution wherever it rears its ugly head. They will play whack-a-mole with radical revolutionaries. That is what they will all do. And this is actually going to play out. In 1848, the Austrians have a problem with Hungary, and they can't handle it. The Tsar of Russia marches the Russian army into the Austrian Empire, kills thousands of Hungarian revolutionaries, and then marches out without taking anything in return, because we're all in this together. If you live in a house and your nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and your house catches fire, your neighbor probably won't be immediately involved in trying to stop that fire. But if you live in an apartment building on the 15th floor out of 20 floors, your apartment has something that catches fire, that is everyone's problem right away. If you don't control that fire immediately, it will spread like wildfire throughout the apartment building. It may trap people. It may kill people. The smoke from the fire may strangle people. Just as it is keenly important for apartment dwellers to make sure that fire is stopped and everyone chips in to help out immediately because it's in their interest to, the Concert of Europe will stop revolution wherever it can, however it can. And the personification of this is the emperor, the Tsar, Nicholas I, emperor and autocrat of the Russians. And this is what I was going to read to you. I was going to read excerpts from a wonderful biography of Nicholas I. See, I'm not fully accepting that that book isn't where it should be. And he has several quotes that deal with the questions raised by politics and revolution and just having way too much fun at my expense. Fine. Okay. First of all, Nicholas is Tsar and autocrat of all the Russians. His brother Alexander was the Tsar, which means Caesar in Russian, by the way. Tsar is spelled C-Z-A-R in the old way and T-S-A-R in the new way. So he is the Caesar or Tsar, the emperor and autocrat of all the Russians. At this time, in the early 1800s, most of the people of Russia are property. They are serfs. Serfdom had been abolished everywhere else in Europe, but not in Russia. In Russia, most people are born into a form of slavery. Remember, the only difference between serfs and slaves is that slaves can be sold away from their families, away from their plantations. Serfs come with the land, like leather bucket seats come with a luxury car. Like the trees on a piece of property come when you buy a house. The serfs are there, working the land, born into bondage, spending their life working that land and then dying there. But unlike slaves, at least, serfs are reasonably certain that when they marry someone, they're not going to be sold away from them and their children are not going to be separated from them. They at least have that connection to each other and to the land. And the biggest landowner, and therefore the biggest serf owner in all of Russia, is the Tsar himself. And Nicholas famously says, "You might think that a man in my position," this is a paraphrase, obviously, "you may think that a man in my position doesn't have to worry about anything because we just take what we want and we order everything for our own convenience, and we can live a life of absolute luxury without ever having to lift a finger." But that isn't the way my life is. I am a creature of duty. My duty overrides everything else. I'm like a soldier. I do not spend my time enjoying luxuries. I do not spend my money buying them. I am the chief protector of the Russians and of the concert of Europe. Nicholas was called the gendarme of Europe. Do any of you Francais students know what the word, I don't know if there are any French students in here, what the word gendarme means? Or even if you're not a French student, it's a fairly common word. The gendarme, the gendarmerie, that's a group. Put your hand. Want to take a shot? Okay. The gendarme is the policeman. Genderme. Gendarme. It's French for policeman, particularly a patrolman walking a beat. Nicholas is called the gendarme of Europe. When he becomes emperor, his first message is not to the Russian people or the Russian government. It's to the army, which he loves. And he assures the army that, like you officers and men who spend your waking hours in duty and under orders, I am also under orders. I, your czar, your autocrat, your emperor, am under the orders of an iron duty to use my moments and use my strength to protect the world from the chaos of revolution and to protect Russia from enemies, foreign and domestic. Like you, I am a creature of duty. So this is not an emperor who lives the high life. He isn't soft. He isn't self-indulgent. He is the terror of revolutionaries across Europe. He achieves power. He's coronated in, I think, 1825, and he remains in power until the middle of the Crimean War in 1853, I think. So he's in power for over a quarter of a century. And he is so very committed to the idea of stopping revolution as a member of the Concert of Europe that everyone who wants to overthrow the order and replace it with something more radical has to contend with the possibility that some way, somehow, the Russian army is going to be sicked on you, like a scary guard dog. And Nicholas will be the one who releases the guard dog so it can rip out your throat. He is a scary, scary man. And he wants to be a scary, scary man. Because he says also, had the French king had any backbone, had he had any appreciation of the duty that he should have borne, that man would never have allowed the tennis court oath to go unpunished. Those radicals who made that oath who would have been rounded up and shot before sunset. If the king had any guts, he would have made damn sure that revolution was met by quick and certain death. And had King Louis XVI done that, Europe would have been spared 26 years of general warfare and social chaos. I'm not going to make that mistake. So, this is the system that is set up. I think what I'll do is, in terms of my lecture, I'm going to time. Okay, I've got time to do this, so I'm going to do this. Um, Besides Russia, the other really powerful of these concert of Europe powers is Great Britain. The British, in the 1805 Battle of Cape Trafalgar, establish a naval dominance that lasts at least through World War One, possibly, arguably, into World War Two. For 100 to 150 years, Britannia literally rules the waves. How did this happen? In 1805, the Franco-Spanish combined fleet met the English fleet, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson near Cape Trafalgar off the coast of southern Spain, near Cadiz. Standard practice at the time was to line up your battleships in a battle line, parallel course, blasting at each other. The French tended to blast at the rigging of these sailing ships and try to kill the crew and destroy the sails so that they could board and capture. The British invested in heavier cannon that could sink the enemy ships by penetrating their wooden hulls with iron cannonballs. At Trafalgar, Nelson, the British commander, breaks the rules, a bit like Miltiades did at Marathon. He doesn't follow the rules. Instead of paralleling the course, he lets the Franco-Spanish fleet, which is considerably larger than his, move ahead, and then he turns into the Franco-Spanish battle line. Now, this seems like stupid thing. Warships carry their guns on their sides, not on their fronts. A fighter plane carries its weapons on its front. But a warship is narrow in the front and long. More room for guns along the center line. So he is aiming into the maximum firepower of the Franco-Spanish fleet. He gambles that they're going to be so unnerved by this that their shooting will be off. And he's somewhat right. What he does is he and his ships penetrate the the Franco-Spanish fleet, and they get to fire in both directions. And the rear part of the Franco-Spanish fleet doesn't know what to do because they're cut off from their admiral, and they have not been trained to show initiative. So Nelson, by breaking the rules, defeats a much more large and powerful force, ensuring British naval dominance, again, for a century to a century and a half into the future. Well, the British are going to use this to build an empire like the world has never seen before or since. The Royal Navy enforces what becomes known as the Pax Britannica. This is a reference to what you learned last year, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of time where the government of Imperial Rome ensured that nothing major would disturb society by protecting society from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And for many hundreds of years of the empire, nobody was strong enough to challenge the Roman army. Well, throughout this time, nobody is strong enough to challenge the British Navy. And the lifeblood of global trade is no longer land on roads, it is sea on ships. By controlling the waves, the British Navy controls global trade and does so to its advantage. And it ends up replacing its lost colonies in British North America with India, along with other colonies around the world. We'll talk about the extent of the British Empire later. But as Nicholas on land preserves Europe from revolution, the British Navy at sea preserves the world from another conflict by making sure that piracy and slavery, well, we'll talk about slavery in a moment, piracy is not allowed to prosper, and that no foreign power gets a navy anything close to what the British have. Britain after the war. After any kind of major war in a free society, there is often a period of libertinism, of sensualism, of sex, drugs, and rock and rollism. After the Vietnam War, which we could have won, but we lost, the American society experienced the glory of the disco era in the 1970s, which literally was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The preferred drug was cocaine. I remember the 70s. I lived through it. But it got people's minds off of the war that had cost so much. It basically numbed the pain. After the World War One, you had the flapper era in the Roaring Twenties, a time when women went out in public and smoked and danced and had money and spent money on booze. In America, from gangsters, because you couldn't buy booze legally thanks to prohibition. It was a time of sex, booze, and jazz. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll for the 1970s, sex, booze, and jazz for the 1920s. But it's the same thing. After a terrible struggle, people party to numb the pain. Well, after the Napoleonic Wars, British society became a cesspool of self indulgence. And they had their own form of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It wasn't safe to walk the streets in many neighborhoods because crime spiraled out of control. Innocence, the innocence especially of young ladies, was not something that was easy to preserve in this period of time. After about a decade of this, people usually get sick of it. Usually it takes less than a decade, somewhere between 5 and 8 years. Usually this period of intense self-indulgence tends to burn itself out. In the case of Britain, the end of the self-indulgence has a name, and his name is Lord William Wilberforce. And it's not that he goes around criticizing people for drinking too much or for sleeping around on their spouses. He calls Britain to a higher duty. Not another Napoleonic war, but something cleaner, something better. A struggle that will ennoble the people engaged in it. And that struggle is against the horrific idea that a Christian nation can abide human beings owning other human beings as property. William Wilberforce, in the 1820s in England, leads a crusade against slavery. At first, the British people and leadership laugh at him for being basically naive. Slavery has always existed in every society. We at least are more humane about it than some. Wilberforce says there's no form of humane slavery. When you exploit other people as if they're cattle, you're not engaged in anything that's morally defensible. You're engaged in obscenity. So I'm going to call it obscenity. You can't do that and think of yourself as a good person. And a nation cannot do that and think of itself as a good nation. Britain has a sense of itself, as the United States does, as Russia does, that we are a special nation because not only do we aspire to greatness in terms of our wealth and power, we aspire to goodness. We aspire to ideals of freedom and liberty and human rights. Well, the British think of themselves that way also. But the British Empire has slavery. Wilberforce's criticisms begin to sting. And people who couldn't find a place for themselves in this new post-war world begin to find a place in the anti-slavery crusade of Wilberforce. What I mean by that, and I said that clumsily, I know. I don't know if you know anyone who's come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. I do. I've had several students who have. And before that, I knew people who had come back from other wars. And many folk in the military who were good in the military have difficulty adjusting to civilian life. You see, in the military, there's this sense that everyone who's there, because we have an all-volunteer military, is honorable. And that Army values are honorable values. And this applies to all the services. In the civilian world, there is no sense of we're all in this together. That's a rarity. In the civilian world, backstabbing, betrayal, and nasty gossip are the norm. In the military, they're the exception. In the civilian world, there are rarely times when everyone comes together to try to be their best selves. in the military, that's something you're expected to do, especially in a war zone. So to find a place for yourself in the civilian world after a war, it's a big, big problem for a lot of former soldiers. Some of them end up in the street as homeless because they cannot make the transition. Well, Wilberforce's anti-slavery crusade offers Britain a chance to fight for something clean and laudable that will bring out their best. And before the end of the 1820s, the British Empire does something amazing in the history of human beings. It not only outlaws slavery, but it sets the British Navy on anyone who is going to try to move slaves by sea. Britain closes down almost the entire world's international slave trade. The slaves of Jamaica are freed from their slavery in the sugar fields. African slaves that are still being bought by people in the American South to harvest tobacco and later cotton, they're no longer able to get slaves. The British make it impossible. They set up an anti-slavery patrol off the Guinea coast of Africa. You see the map of Africa behind Mr. Cudmore. The part of Africa that's on the upper left, the bottom of that, the sort of underside of the chin, that's the Guinea coast. That's where the slaves mostly came from. So the British set up permanent naval patrols to stop slavery. Throughout the 19th century, the British fight a series of wars to stop slavery. They actually come closer than anyone to stopping the slavery of blacks in Arabia, the smuggling of black Africans from East Africa and the Horn of Africa across the Red Sea into Arabia. That still goes on today. The British came closer to stopping that trade than anyone else, and they did it by conquering all the way up to the Nile, all the way up the Nile from its source around Lake Victoria down to or northwards to Egypt. So Britain uses its power as an anti-slavery crusade. No one else in the world does that except the Union in the American Civil War. And even then, the Union does not take on the universal mission of ending slavery everywhere. It just takes on the mission of preserving the Union and ending slavery in the rebel states in the South, and ultimately everywhere in the United States. So this is the political landscape on which the Industrial Revolution will play out. It is a landscape of political stasis, with the exception of the anti-slavery crusade. But there's something ironic about this, because it is during those years of absolute stasis that the biggest change in human life since we developed farming, it begins to take hold. So you can hope for stasis all you want, but in the end, life goes on. And while the concert of Europe is preserving the peace, the Industrial Revolution is changing life in a way that is unimaginably intimate and basic. Everyone is affected. Before we're done, the two great treaties of modern times. Congress of Vienna in 1815 is the peace treaty that settles things that rebuilds the world after the Napoleonic Wars. The Treaty of Versailles is the great peace treaty that resets the world after World War I. Basic comparisons. The chief figure of the Congress of Vienna is Prince Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister. He is the architect. The most important figure in the Treaty of Versailles is President Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, President of the United States. The Congress of Vienna is a conservative peace. It tries to turn back time and keep things stable. Political stability means no revolution, or very little revolution, or controlling the spread of revolution, and people working together to that end. Wilson's peace is very progressive, because he was a progressive. What Wilson tries to do is solve the problem of European wars by creating microstates, tiny little European countries where every nation group has its own country. But these countries are so small, and their economies are basically pieces of the pie that used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire. The railroads don't work for the independent states. The size of the independent states means they have minuscule military power. They can't defend themselves. So the Congress of Vienna was anti-idealist. The Treaty of Versailles was very idealistic. And here's the result. The Congress of Vienna prevents major revolution from 1815 to 1848. That's, let's see, 25, 35, 45, 33 years. And the Congress of Vienna's system basically prevents another major war for 99 years. World War I starts 99 years after the Congress of Vienna. On the other hand, the Treaty of Versailles, with all of its idealism, sows the seeds of a world war greater than World War I 20 years later. 1919, the year after World War I ends, the Treaty of Versailles is signed. 20 years later, September 1st, 1939, Hitler's tanks roll into Poland, starting World War II. One worked, the other did not. Thank you for your time. See you tomorrow. Remember, Chapter Survey 20 is due this coming Monday. Bye-bye.